For Robert Henderson, a Sunday morning always began the same way. Not with an alarm clock. His internal clock, calibrated by 45 years of rising at 5 a.m., was more reliable than any machine. It began with the creak of a floorboard in the hallway, the one he'd been meaning to fix for the last 10 years, but never got around to. That creak was part of the house, part of him. Just like the silence, thick as morning fog, that enveloped every object in his living room. At 65, Robert was a man carved from rock. Not granite, that was too smooth and cold. More like sandstone, weathered by wind and rain into a map of lines and cracks, but its core integrity unshaken. His hands, resting calmly on the worn arms of his oak armchair, were a testament to his life. Knotted knuckles, scars from slipped saws and stubborn nails, the kind of ingrained grime that soap could no longer touch. With these hands, he had mixed the concrete for this house's foundation. With these hands, he had rocked his daughter, Anna, as a baby. With these hands, he had held his wife, Sarah's, as she passed from this world, right in their bedroom upstairs. He glanced out the window. His old 1998 Ford F-150 sat at the curb, coated in a fine layer of dust. The paint was faded on the hood, and rust was creeping up the wheel wells. But Robert knew that if he turned the key, the V8 engine would roar to life with a steady, dependable rumble. That truck was his trusted partner. It had hauled lumber, bags of cement, a baby stroller, and once a Christmas tree so tall it scraped the ceiling, because a 5-year-old Anna had declared that Santa wouldn't notice a smaller one. Folks, if this story is already hitting home, do me a favor and hit that like and subscribe button. Let me know what city you're tuning in from. Let's get this heard. But this particular Sunday was poisoned by anticipation. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, ringing in his ears. Anna was coming for lunch with her husband, Mark. Robert had made a pot roast, Sarah's recipe. The aroma of rosemary and garlic, which usually filled the house with a sense of comfort, felt out of place today, almost defiant. At 1 o'clock sharp, a gleaming black sedan, a German import Robert privately called the Soap Bar, pulled into the driveway. Out stepped Anna and Mark. Anna, his girl, his sunshine, was now a 35-year-old woman with tired eyes and a tense line around her mouth. She wore a stylish dress that looked alien against the backdrop of Robert's aging front porch. Mark, her husband, was Robert's polar opposite. Soft manicured hands, an expensive haircut, and a perfectly pressed shirt. He always looked at Robert with a mixture of polite curiosity and faint condescension, the way a city man looks at a farmer. They sat at the solid maple dining table, the one Robert had built right after he and Sarah married. The conversation sputtered. They talked about the weather. They talked about politics, a topic on which Mark spoke with a smooth, confident authority, using words Robert only ever heard on the news. Robert mostly nodded and grunted in agreement. He felt like a stranger in his own home. The conflict began with a single drop of water, a slow, heavy drop from the faucet in the first-floor bathroom, landing with a hollow plink in the porcelain sink. That barely audible sound was the detonator. "Dad, I asked you to look at that faucet 3 weeks ago," Anna said, pushing her plate away. The roast barely touched. Her tone was level, but underneath it lay an ocean of old grievances. "I'll get to it," Robert replied, not looking up. "Needs a new washer. I'll pick one up during the week." "During the week," she repeated, with a bitter little laugh. "Your favorite phrase. This whole house is falling apart, and you don't even notice. Do you even live here? Or do you just sleep here?" Mark gave a delicate cough into his fist. "Honey, I'm sure your father has been busy. Busy? What is he busy with? He's retired. Anna's voice cracked, then hardened. No, Mark, it's not about the faucet. You know it's not. It's about the fact that he's never cared. Not about the house, not about Mom, not about me. His job, his construction sites, his projects. That was all that mattered. We were just the background scenery. Robert raised his head. His gray eyes, usually as calm as a lake on a windless day, began to storm. He wanted to tell her he noticed everything. He noticed the third step on the staircase creaked. He noticed the shingles on the north side of the roof were starting to curl. He noticed the dark circles under her eyes and the way she twisted her wedding ring when she was nervous. He wanted to ask if she was happy with this man who looked at her, like she was another one of his successful mergers. But the words, as always, were stuck in his chest, heavy and immovable as bags of cement. Did you ever once ask me how I was feeling? She pressed on, her eyes welling up. Not how's work, not do you need money, but what was going on in my soul. Do you remember my high school graduation? All the other fathers were dancing with their daughters. You just stood against the wall, like a stranger. He remembered. He remembered his heart aching with pride for her, so beautiful in her white dress. But he hadn't asked her to dance because there was a grease stain on his only suit that wouldn't come out, and his work boots felt clumsy and monstrous on the polished gymnasium floor. He didn't want to embarrass her. He thought she'd understand. And when Jamie was born, your only grandson, you came to the hospital, stood there for 5 minutes, handed me an envelope with cash in it, and left. Like you were paying a bill. Did you ever once hold him without being asked? He remembered that too. He'd been terrified of holding that tiny, fragile creature in his rough, calloused hands. Terrified of hurting him, of dropping him. He thought it was better to stand back than to do harm. I've been talking to my therapist, Anna finally blurted out, and the word therapist landed in the old living room like a gunshot. She says it's a classic case. You were a wonderful provider, Dad. No one is denying that. But as a father, you were emotionally distant. A void, a ghost in our own family photos. Emotionally distant. The two words pierced him like shards of glass. He looked at his daughter, and it was like seeing a stranger. This confident, articulate woman who sat at his table in the house he built, passing judgment on his entire life. And that's when something inside him broke. A quiet, dry snap. Like an old timber beam finally giving way under a lifetime of weight, he rose slowly from his chair. The oak groaned a long, sad note as it released him. He took in the scene. Anna, her face tear-streaked but resolute. Mark, watching his wife with a look of feigned sympathy, but with a flicker of triumph in his eyes. Wait here, Robert said. His voice was quiet, level, stripped of all emotion. He really had become cold. Just now. He turned and walked down the hall to his den, a tiny room that smelled of dust and old paper. He didn't turn on the light. His hands found the heavy steel safe hidden in the back of the closet, behind a stack of old blueprints. He hadn't opened it in years, but the combination was burned into his muscle memory like a brand. 1-2-0-8, Anna's birthday. The tumblers clicked. The heavy door swung open with a groan. Inside lay a single, thick, worn leather folio. A folio containing the paper ghosts of his love. He took it out. It was heavy. When he returned to the living room, they were sitting in silence, waiting. He walked to the table and, without a word, placed the folio in front of Anna. He opened it. The top document was the mortgage agreement for her and Mark's house. big, beautiful home in a prestigious suburb. Underneath it was a payment schedule for the last 15 years, every month on the 20th, an amount that was equal to almost his entire current pension. Neat check marks from the bank beside every single transaction drawn from his account. Then he began laying out the other papers, one by one, like cards in a final, losing hand. The tuition bills for all 4 years of her college, each stamped paid. The orthodontist's receipts for her braces, the very ones he'd worked through her piano recital to pay for. The bill of sale for his old fishing boat, the money from which had been the down payment on her first car. And at the very bottom, a yellowed slip of paper from a notepad, a note from Sarah, written a month before she died. Rob, don't forget to pay Anna's car insurance. She's so overwhelmed. Stapled to it was the canceled check. Anna stared at the documents, the color draining from her face, leaving a pale, shocked mask. Her ring-adorned fingers trembled as she reached for the mortgage payment schedule. I don't understand, she whispered. Mark, you told me your parents helped us with the house. Mark swallowed hard. Well, they helped with the down payment. I didn't want to burden you with the details. The details? Robert allowed himself a bitter smile for the first time all evening. These details are 15 years of my life. 180 payments. 180 times I went without something. So my daughter could have a roof over her head she didn't have to worry about. He stood up straighter, and in that moment, he seemed to fill the room. He looked directly into his daughter's eyes. This is my emotional distance, Anna. It's in these checks. It's in this mortgage. It's in that sold boat. I don't know how to talk about love. I only know how to build it, brick by brick, payment by payment. The bitterness he had swallowed for decades finally surfaced, not in a shout, but in a quiet, lethal verdict. If I had known that in my old age I'd just be a ghost at my own family table. His voice was as steady and hard as steel. I probably would have bought that boat instead, and I would have sailed it so far away, I couldn't hear the judgment of the very people I was living for. He turned and walked out to the back porch, leaving them alone with the paper mausoleum of his silent sacrifice. He sat down on the old swinging bench. Its creak was his only answer. The evening wind blew dust across the road. He closed his eyes. The silence had returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of freedom, or maybe the silence of a final, clean break. He didn't know yet. Night fell on the small Ohio town, but sleep wouldn't come for Robert. He remained in his armchair as the living room became a theater of shadows, each one a memory given form. The folio of documents still lay open on the dining table, an exhibit in a trial that had been recessed but not concluded. He never heard Anna and Mark leave. The quiet click of the front door was the only sign that he was alone again. But this solitude wasn't peaceful. It was ringing with the echo of his daughter's words. Emotionally distant, he closed his eyes and the walls of the house dissolved, transporting him back through the decades. This wasn't just remembrance. It was an arraignment, a long and painful hearing where he was the defendant, the judge, and the sole witness for his own defense. He is 25, but he looks 30. He's standing waist-deep in a pit he dug with his own 2 hands on this very plot of land. The July heat is a physical presence, the air shimmering and thick. He's mixing concrete by hand in a rusted-out wheelbarrow. The shovel feels like an extension of his arms. The muscles in his back and shoulders are a single screaming knot of fire. Salty sweat stings his eyes, mingling with the caustic cement dust. Sarah, her belly just starting to show, sits in the shade of the property's single oak tree, wiping her own brow with a handkerchief. He sees the love and the worry in her eyes. "Rob, honey, please stop." Her voice drifts over to him, sounding like it's from another world. "You're going to give yourself a heat stroke." He just shakes his head, unable to break his rhythm. He has to get the foundation poured before tomorrow. The weatherman is calling for thunderstorms. If the pit floods, weeks of work will be washed away, and they don't have the money or the time to start over. He made her a promise. He promised their unborn child that he would have a home. Not a rented apartment with complaining neighbors. Not a room in her parents' house. A real home. Of his own. He works until the orange disk of the sun bleeds into the horizon. When the last of the concrete is smoothed into the forms, his strength gives out completely. He hauls himself out of the pit and collapses onto the grass beside Sarah. He lays his throbbing head in her lap and is asleep almost instantly, oblivious to the buzzing of cicadas and her gentle stroking hand. He doesn't say, "I'm doing this because I love you and our future." He just pours the foundation. He's sure she understands they're the same thing, and she did, but Sarah was gone, and his daughter did not understand. Anna is 10. She is sitting at a grand piano on the stage of the school auditorium. She practiced this Clementi sonatina for a month, her fingers like frightened birds learning to fly across the keys. Sarah made her a flowing white dress with a blue satin sash. She looked like an angel. "Daddy, you promise you'll come? You promise?" She'd asked him every night that week, her eyes shining with a child's unwavering faith. "I promise, sweetheart." "Front row," he'd said, and he had meant it with every fiber of his being. But the day before the recital, disaster struck on a job site. The Newtown library he was supervising. A cold snap hit overnight, and a main water pipe burst. Water was flooding the basement, threatening the newly installed drywall. His boss, Pete Sullivan, called him at 6 a.m. "Rob, you're the only one who can fix this. If we don't get the heat back on by morning, we're looking at thousands in damages. I'll give you double time, plus a bonus." Double time. A bonus. The words hammered in his head. Sarah had a bad toothache, and a root canal would cost a fortune. Anna needed new winter boots. Her old ones were worn through. He pictured Sarah's face, wincing in pain. He pictured his daughter's wet, cold feet, and he made his choice. He spent the next 20 hours in a frigid, half-flooded basement. His fingers were numb with cold, and he scraped his knuckles raw when a wrench slipped. Through the roar of the propane heater and the hiss of leaking water, he tried to imagine his daughter walking onto the stage. He saw her take a bow. He saw her delicate fingers touch the keys. He could almost hear the sonatina in his head, a faint, beautiful melody drowned out by the clang of pipes and the curses of his crew. When he finally got home, exhausted and filthy, the recital was long over. Anna was sitting on the living room couch, still in her white dress. She wasn't crying. It was worse than that. She looked at him with dry, strangely adult eyes. "You didn't come," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. "I'm sorry, baby girl. There was an emergency at work," he said, his voice hoarse and full of shame. He held out a Hershey bar he'd bought at a gas station. She didn't even look at it. He didn't tell her about the boots or Sarah's tooth. He thought it would sound like an excuse, an attempt to buy her forgiveness. So he just stayed silent. He was sure that when she grew up, she would understand. But she grew up, and all she remembered was the empty chair in the front row. His dreams smelled of lake water and two-stroke engine oil. It was a simple, 16-foot aluminum fishing boat, a Lund with a little Johnson outboard motor. Not for showing off, not for racing, for silence. He dreamt of taking it out at sunrise, cutting the engine in the middle of the lake, and just listening to the world wake up. He'd fish, or maybe just sit there, watching the bobber and thinking about nothing at all. He carried a picture of that boat, clipped from an old Field and Stream magazine, in his wallet for over a decade. It was soft and frayed at the creases. For his 40th birthday, he'd finally saved up enough. He'd even found the perfect one for sale, owned by an old guy in the next county. He could already picture taking Anna out, teaching her how to bait a hook. A week later, Anna brought home a thick envelope from the mailbox. She'd been accepted to the state university. A good one. The joy in the house was immense, but that evening, when he and Sarah sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the tuition bill for the first year, the joy was replaced by a quiet, gnawing panic. Their savings wouldn't cover it. They sat in silence for a long time, sipping their cold tea. Sarah looked at his hands. Robert looked out the window. Then, without a word, he took out his wallet. He pulled out the worn picture of the boat, smoothed it on the table, and gave it one last, long look. "Maybe next year, Rob," Sarah said softly, covering his hand with hers. "Maybe," he echoed, but they both knew there would be no next year. The next day, he withdrew every dollar from his boat fund and added it to their savings. He gave the money to Anna, telling her he'd gotten a big bonus at work. He saw the ecstasy on her face, felt her arms wrap around his neck. "Thank you, Daddy. I love you. You're the best," she'd shouted. And in that moment, it felt like it was worth more than 1,000 boats. He thought that sacrificing his own dream for her future was the ultimate act of a father's love. He never told her what he'd given up. He thought it would sound like he was holding it over her head. Robert opened his eyes. The living room was filled with the cold, gray light of dawn. The memories receded, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. He stood up and walked back to the table. He picked up the mortgage statement. For 180 months, he had buried his dream of that boat, one payment at a time. All to be told, he was emotionally distant. The irony was so cruel it felt like rust in his throat. I was silent for 20 years, he thought. But I guess I swallowed more than I should have. And now, it was all coming back up. The days following that Sunday lunch crawled by like a wounded animal. Robert tried to lose himself in his routines, fixing the loose slats on the back fence, tinkering with the engine of his old lawnmower, driving his truck into town for groceries. But nothing was the same. The world had lost its color. His trusty F-150 felt like a pile of rust. The familiar creak of his armchair grated on his nerves, and the house he had built with such love felt alien and hostile. He was on guard, like a soldier in a foxhole, waiting for the next shot. He didn't know where it would come from, but he knew it was coming. It came on Thursday evening in the form of a phone call. An unfamiliar number from Anna and Mark's area code. Robert answered. "Robert, it's Mark. Hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." The voice was smooth and oily as ever, but this time there was a new undertone of cold steel. "What is it?" Robert said. His own heart began to beat with a slow, heavy rhythm, like a blacksmith's hammer. "I'm calling about that unfortunate incident on Sunday. Anna is still a complete wreck. You did a real number on her with that performance with the documents." Performance. Robert fixated on the word. His life, his sacrifices, his pain, all of it was just a theatrical show for his son-in-law. "We've been talking, Anna and I, and her therapist," Mark said, pausing for effect. "And we've all come to the conclusion that your behavior shows classic signs of passive aggression and financial manipulation. You see, Using money to induce guilt in a loved one is a very toxic pattern. Robert was silent. He looked down at his calloused hand resting on the kitchen table. Toxic. Another word from their world. In his world, paint thinner was toxic. Helping your own kid was not. I wasn't trying to make her feel guilty. I was showing her the facts, he finally said. Facts can be interpreted in many ways, Robert, Mark replied in a patronizing tone. Your truth is a set of numbers on paper. Anna's truth is her emotional trauma, the trauma of having a father who was physically present, but mentally and emotionally absent. We believe this unhealthy financial tie between you needs to be severed for everyone's well-being. What are you trying to say, Mark? Robert asked, though a cold dread was already beginning to form in the pit of his stomach. We want to take over the mortgage entirely, refinance in our names, but for the bank to do that, you would need to legally relinquish any and all claims to the property. It's just a formality. Our lawyer is already drafting the paperwork. We'll send it over next week. All you'll have to do is sign. It's the right thing to do. The fair thing. It will allow us all to start building a healthy relationship from a clean slate. Robert froze. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. They didn't just want to take the house from him. They wanted to erase his name from its history. They were asking him to sign a document that would officially declare that his 30-year sacrifice meant nothing, that he had been a temporary inconvenience, a human ATM that could now be decommissioned. I'll think about it, was all he could manage before hanging up the phone. That was the first blow. The knockout punch came the next day. His younger brother Dave called from Florida. Dave was the only person on earth with whom Robert could talk, in his own gruff way, about almost anything. Rob? What the hell is going on up there? Dave's voice was tight with concern. What do you mean? Robert asked, though he already knew. Anna just called me, sobbing her eyes out. Said you two had a terrible fight, that you screamed at her, threw a bunch of old receipts in her face, and demanded that she immediately pay you back every cent you ever spent on her. Rob, is that true? What's gotten into you? The world tilted under Robert's feet. He had to lean against the wall to steady himself. A lie. A shameless, monstrous lie. She hadn't just failed to understand his pain. She had twisted it, inverted it, rewritten history to cast him as a cruel, greedy old man and herself as the innocent victim. And she had told this lie to the one person whose opinion still mattered to him. She wasn't just wounding him. She was trying to isolate him, to burn his last bridge. Is that what she told you? He asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. Yeah. Said she always knew you had a mean streak, but she never thought you'd go this far. Said you threatened to throw her, Mark, and Jamie out on the street. Rob, for God's sake, that's your daughter. Your grandson. I know who she is, Dave, Robert said quietly, and he ended the call. He set the phone down on the table. Inside him, something clicked. A dry, sharp, final sound. It wasn't the sound of anger. Anger would have been a relief, a hot emotion. This was the sound of water freezing into ice. Hard, sharp, and unforgiving. All the other feelings, the hurt, the grief, the bitterness, drained away, leaving only a cold, ringing void. And in that void, a crystal-clear resolution was born. He was a ghost. Fine. He was a void. Perfect. But they had forgotten one thing. Even a void has weight. Even a ghost can cast a shadow. He would no longer justify. He would no longer argue. He would no longer wait for understanding or remorse. He had been a man of action his whole life, and he would be a man of action now. Not with his fists or his voice. He would answer their toxicity and their performances in the only language he had left, the language of consequences. He walked to the window. The wind was whipping the branches of the old oak tree, the one Sarah had sat under while he poured the foundation of their life. No more, he said aloud to the empty room. No more. On Monday, Robert woke up long before the sun. But this was a different kind of waking. He felt none of his usual morning stiffness or quiet apathy. Instead, a cold, electric energy pulsed through him. He moved through the house with the measured precision of a man with a plan. He didn't pull on his usual work clothes. He went to his closet and took out his best suit, the dark gray one he'd worn to Sarah's funeral. He put on a crisp white shirt and carefully knotted a tie. Looking at his reflection in the old dresser mirror, he didn't see a broken old man. He saw a man on his way to an important business meeting, which, in a way, he was. He was on his way to close the worst deal of his life. He didn't drive to the big, impersonal bank downtown. He drove to the small branch on the edge of town, a low brick building that hadn't changed much in 30 years. Behind the counter sat Janice Mayfield, a woman his age with kind eyes behind a pair of tortoiseshell glasses. They had been in the same high school graduating class. "Robert, what brings you here?" She greeted him with a warm smile. "And all dressed up. You planning on robbing the place?" Robert allowed himself the faintest trace of a smile. "Almost, Janice. I'm here to stop funding it." He sat down in the chair opposite her and slid a piece of paper across the counter. A printout of the automatic mortgage payment details. "I need to cancel this transfer. Permanently." Janice's smile faded. She looked from the paper to his face. In a small town, family dramas were rarely secrets. The gossip had probably already started, but she was a professional and a friend. "That's a big step, Rob," she said softly. "Are you sure? There might be no going back from this." "I'm not planning on going back, Janice," he said, his voice as firm as concrete. "I've been going in the wrong direction for too long." She nodded, understanding without needing more words. Her fingers tapped quickly on the keyboard. A printer in the corner whirred to life and spat out a form. "Here, sign on both lines." Robert took the pen. The hand that had held everything from a sledgehammer to a tiny screw was perfectly steady. He signed his name. The stroke of the pen was confident and final. It wasn't just a signature. It was a severance. It was a declaration of his own personal independence. "All done," Janice said, taking the form. "Starting this month, the payment will not go through. The bank will notify the property holders accordingly." "Thank you, Janice," he said, standing up. "You take care of yourself, Robert," she called after him. Walking out into the cool morning air, he took a deep breath. It felt like the first real breath he'd taken in years. An invisible weight, the weight of 15 years of monthly payments, had been lifted from his shoulders. He didn't feel vindictive. He felt light. When he got home, he didn't take off his suit. He sat down at his old desk, where a photo of a smiling Sarah still stood. He gently laid his hand over the photo, as if asking for both her forgiveness and her blessing. Then he took out a fresh sheet of paper and a pen. He was going to write a letter. Not to Anna or Mark. He was writing to the local newspaper, the County Herald, to the weekly column called Voices of Our Town. He'd never been a man of words. Wood and steel were his language, but now the words came. Simple, heavy and honest. He wrote for hours, crossing out and rewriting, choosing each word as carefully as he would choose stones for a fireplace hearth. He didn't complain about his daughter. He didn't mention their fight. He wrote about the silence of his generation. My name is Robert Henderson. I'm 65 years old, and for 40 of those years, I built houses in this county. Chances are, I may have helped build yours. I come from a generation of men who were taught that love is a verb. It's to provide, to protect, to build. We weren't taught to say, I love you. We were taught to show it with our work, with our sweat, with our exhaustion. We believed that a warm bed, a full plate, and a paid bill spoke of love more eloquently than any poem. Our tenderness was in the strength of a roof. Our affection was in an engine that started on a cold winter morning. We are a silent generation. We did not parade our sacrifices. We did not ask for thanks for the school plays we missed or the fishing trips we canceled. We simply did what a man was supposed to do. We thought that was self-evident. But I have come to realize that in this new world, our silence is often mistaken for indifference, our stoicism for emotional coldness, our labor, which we saw as the foundation of our family's happiness, has become invisible. It's taken for granted, like the air we breathe. I am not writing this letter for pity. Pity is for the weak. I am writing this for the hundreds of other silent men in our town, for the mechanic who spends his Sunday fixing someone else's car so he can pay for his daughter's music lessons, for the farmer who gets up at 4 a.m. so his kids can sleep until 8, for every man who has expressed his love with the calluses on his hands instead of with pretty words. Your work is not invisible. Your silence is not a void. It holds the hum of factories, the clang of hammers, and the roar of engines. It has built entire worlds. Do not let anyone devalue it. Sometimes, to be heard, you just have to stop being silent, and I have decided my time has come. He reread what he had written. He folded the pages and put them in an envelope. He didn't just mail it. He drove to the newspaper office and slid the envelope through the mail slot in the front door. The sound of it landing on the floor inside was, to him, the sound of a starter pistol. He was beginning a new race, and this time, he was running for himself. Then he drove to the lake. He sat on the edge of an old wooden pier, his legs dangling over the water. And for the first time since Sarah died, he let himself cry. Silently, heavily, with the racking sobs of a man who had held it in for too long. He wasn't crying for his daughter or his family. He was crying for the Robert who had spent 40 years building a house for others and had forgotten to build one for himself. On Thursday, when the mailman dropped the County Herald in his mailbox, Robert hesitated. He made a pot of coffee, sat in his armchair on the porch, and just stared at the rolled-up paper for a long time. He felt like a teenager waiting for his final grade. At last, he unrolled the rustling pages. It was there. Page 3, under a bold headline, "What Fathers Don't Say." The editor hadn't changed a word. Reading his own thoughts in black and white print, Robert felt a strange mix of embarrassment and pride. It was like seeing himself clearly for the first time. The first call came around 10 o'clock. It was Bill Jenkins, his old partner from the construction days, a man he hadn't spoken to in 5 years after a stupid argument. "Rob, it's Bill. I just read your piece." "Damn it, old friend. It's like you pulled the words right out of my head. I got into it with my own son yesterday over nothing. Then I read this and, well, thanks. Why don't you swing by the garage sometime? We'll have a beer, like the old days." That was just the beginning. The phone, silent for weeks, came to life. Old friends, former co-workers, even strangers called. The widow of his friend Frank called in tears, saying he had honored her husband's memory better than any eulogy ever could. When he went to the hardware store for nails, a young man, maybe 30 years old, came up to him and just silently shook his hand. "Thank you, sir," he said. "You gave me a lot to think about." Robert hadn't become a hero. He had just stopped being invisible. He realized his story wasn't just his. He had given voice to a generation, and it brought him a strange, quiet sense of peace. The storm broke on Saturday morning. He was in his garage, sorting through old tools, when he heard the phone ringing inside. He let it ring, and ring again. When he finally went in, the screen read, 35 missed calls. Anna. Mark. Anna. Mark again. He almost laughed. The bank notice must have arrived. He waited for the 36th call and calmly pressed the answer button. "Dad, thank God. What is going on?" Anna's voice was high-pitched with panic. "I got a letter from the bank. It says the mortgage payment is past due. Did you forget to pay it?" "No, Anna, I didn't forget," Robert said, his voice as calm as the surface of the lake at dawn. "Then what? Why didn't it go through?" "Because I canceled the automatic payments." There was a moment of stunned, absolute silence on the other end of the line. "You..." "What?" she whispered. "But why? How could you? They're going to charge us late fees. We could be evicted." "You won't be. You and Mark have good jobs and 2 cars. You can afford to pay for your own house. That's what grown independent people do." "But this is cruel," she shrieked, tears now evident in her voice. "You're getting revenge on me because I was honest about my feelings." "I'm not getting revenge, Anna," Robert said patiently. "I'm just tired. I'm tired of building bridges just to have them blown up from the other side. I loved you the only way I knew how, with paid bills and a roof over your head. You called that emotionally distant. Fine. I'm removing my distance from your monthly budget. This isn't revenge. This is an adjustment." "Dad, please, don't do this. I was out of line." Her voice changed, becoming pleading. "I didn't know. I'm sorry." But her apology, born of fear and not remorse, no longer held any power over him. "I need some time, Anna," he said firmly. "And so do you. To think. I mailed you all the mortgage documents. It's your problem now. Goodbye." He ended the call before she could reply. He felt nothing. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just a quiet emptiness. But it was a clean, healthy emptiness, like a cleared lot, ready for new construction. The next day, he got in his old F-150 and drove out of town. He drove for hours until he reached a dusty lot, selling used equipment by the big lake. And there, in the back corner, he saw it, his dream. An old, beat-up aluminum Lund boat. The paint was peeling, the seats were cracked, but its hull was as sound as his own heart. He paid for it in cash. With the money he had been saving for a rainy day, he figured that day had finally come. He hauled the boat home and set it up on sawhorses in his backyard. That evening, he just walked around it, running his hands over its rough sides, peering inside. Then he went into his workshop and came back with his orbital sander. The backyard filled with a loud, confident hum. Robert began stripping away the old peeling paint, layer by layer. Underneath, the clean matte shine of aluminum began to appear. It was hard, repetitive work, but his hands seemed to rejoice in it. He wasn't just stripping paint, he was stripping away decades of silence, of resentment, of unspoken pain. He was sanding away the ghost in the family photos. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors of molten steel. Robert worked on, sweat dripping from his face, but he didn't feel tired. He didn't know if Anna would call again. He didn't know if he would ever be able to forgive her. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that he had forgiven himself for being silent too long, for letting others define his worth. The hum of the sander was the only music in the quiet evening. It was the anthem of his new life, a life where he would be the one deciding what to build and for whom. And the first project on his list was this boat. And his own reclaimed soul, he was alone. But for the first time in a very long time, he was not lonely.